So thanks for organizing this very interesting workshop. I like these small conferences very much because there's space for discussions. And when we discussed what we would bring from Hungary, one of the suggestions was to show a methodological example how people living in the landscape today can help landscape historical studies. So I choose from my topics a presentation where we worked with pig keepers in forests and marshes to learn about land use by pigs in earlier historical times. So first, what is traditional or indigenous and local knowledge? This is a non-written knowledge of local people in Europe, especially farmers and herders, but also other land users. This is the cumulative body of knowledge and practices and worldviews. So we have to understand all three dimensions. This is the knowledge of people who live from natural resources and manage natural resources. This knowledge is usually multi-generational, sometimes going back, the living memory goes back to the 19th century. And this knowledge is not static. This is not something which is the knowledge of the past, because it is still adapted. And I will show you examples how pig keepers in Serbia adapt their old knowledge to the present situations. Pig keeping in forests and marshes is a very, very old land use type. And from the ecological dimensions of this land use type, we know very, very little, because historians usually documented mustering on acorns, behavior and social structure of pig keepers, but very little knowledge is available on the impacts of pigs on the forests, on the marshes. This was not only important in the medieval times, but still the middle of the 20th century, at least in Central and Eastern Europe, pig keeping in marshes and forests was widespread. And today, there are interesting cases where pig keeping has a revival, especially in nature conservation to manage certain wetland habitats, but also in biofarming, regenerative farming, where pigs are kept free-ranging to produce better meat. And we should not forget the Dehesa and Montado systems in Spain and Portugal, which are, however, not forests, but wood pastures. So, and in this presentation, I will focus on closed forests and marshes. So the questions, what happens if pigs are kept free-ranging in a species-rich forest marsh mosaic all year round? What are the messages for landscape history? And how can living traditional knowledge help understand past landscapes? In our study, we made a review, a cross-knowledge system, cross-cultural review. Scientific reviews are usually narrative or recently meta-analysis. What we did, we collected knowledge not only from science, but also from traditional knowledge sources. So what we did, we used Western science and traditional knowledge sources on pig foraging, mostly from Southern Europe, Central Europe. We also collected and reviewed literature on wild boar foraging, because wild boar is the same species as domestic pigs. We interviewed and worked with sviňars, pig keepers in Serbia who have living traditional ecological knowledge. And we read ethnographic literature from Central Europe, which we regarded as an archived traditional ecological knowledge, archived or documented by ethnographers or local historians. And we also made our own observations on pig foraging. So we went into the forests and marshes and observed what pigs do in the forest. We focused on three knowledge areas: what pigs eat, when they eat, in which season, and how this foraging is impacted by weather, time of the day, phenology of the plants, and so on. To make a review, cross-knowledge system review, there are really big methodological challenges. So as soon as you have the review question, the hypothesis or a knowledge gap or a conflict in land use, then you have to mobilize available knowledge. For a scientific review, it's clear, we select publications, but for traditional knowledge, it's not as trivial. So how you find and select reliable traditional knowledge holders, that's already a challenge. Then you have to translate the knowledges into each other's spheres. And there are problems with species nomenclatures and ecological terms and models different knowledge systems use. And also there is a problem with study size, because for pigs you have most studies from Spain and Portugal, and for other topics you have more data from Germany or Hungary or Serbia. Then you have to structure the available information coming from science or from traditional knowledge. You have to compare it, validate information, and that's a tricky issue. I will not go into the details, but you can read some papers on this. And then you synthesize what you have found. You look for consistencies, inconsistencies, contradictions, knowledge gaps, and you can come up with conclusions and new hypotheses. And when you apply these results from the review, you can use it in science, in conservation, or even farmers, the swinyards, can use. That's why we are publishing our results also as in a book form in Serbian language as well. This is just a short list of some of the key papers on domestic pig literature, scientific literature. These are some papers from wild boar scientific literature. And these are the examples of ethnographic historical literature we collected from our region, because our study area for the fieldwork is in Serbia, close to the Bosnian border. So we looked for historical ethnographic literature from this region, and we found hundreds of good data. This is the study area in Serbia, a dense forest, floodplain forest with embedded marshes, and in the surrounding elevated places there are settlements. And these are our herder colleagues and friends. These people have very long personal experience of the forests and marshes and the pigs' behavior in these habitats and the pigs' impact on forests and marshes. And they also share this knowledge with each other. The challenge is how to find a good review, because you know, if the knowledge is not written in scientific papers, then you have to read the knowledge from the head of these people, and this knowledge is orally stored. So we had to look for those swinyards who actually has deep knowledge, personal knowledge, and also synthetic knowledge about the community. So we looked for these people. We found 7 highly knowledgeable persons, and we worked with them for 5 years, hundreds of interviews, and we use different methods for the elicitation. We use pictures, semi-structured interviews. We went into the landscape with them, and they were explaining us the impact and behavior of pigs. And we also did participatory field work. So we went with them pasturing the pigs. And we also spent 21 days by observing the pigs. And we also interviewed the swineards about our observations. So this was the methodology. And we also published a paper in Trends in Ecology and Evolution and on how this methodology can be applied by ecologists. There were some nice challenges. So if a herder is speaking about a plant that has no local name, then you have to translate the knowledge into scientific understanding. And sometimes our questions were not answered because the swineards did not have knowledge on certain species or on certain situations. This is our research group, Serbian and Hungarian colleagues, botanists, ethnobotanists, conservationists, and we worked together in the last years. So this is again the landscape. It's a Quercus carpinus fraxinus wet forest with marshes of Carex, Glyceria, and Scenoplectus. This is how it looks like. Some forests are really nice, old, and marshes are species rich. These are the peaks. As I mentioned earlier, swineards adapt their knowledge to modern situations, so they don't anymore keep traditional breeds, but they use modern breeds. But these breeds are already knowledgeable about the forest because their parents, mothers, grandmothers also lived in these forests. This is a resting place for the pigs and the swineards. Another one. I just show some pictures to introduce you to the landscape and how pigs behave in these. We also have a video, an 8 minutes long video. I can share the link in the chat later. Swineards became scientists because if they didn't know something, then in the next weeks and months, they monitor, they observe their pigs, find an answer to our questions. So they were really lovely colleagues in the forest. Pigs are also grazing, eating acorns, earthworms, resting on the margin of marshes. Even swimming in the marshes, in the rivers for mussels and for snails. They are hiding from mosquitoes and horseflies. This is acorning musting in October when the acorns already are on the ground. This is a summary slide of what plants they consume, roots and leaves and fruits. And this is a slide showing the animals they forage on, especially on earthworms. I will speak about it a bit later. But they eat everything which is called fish. That's their favorite. They even prefer it over corn and acorn. So some selected results. We have a huge database. We will publish the database in an appendix. So anybody interested in the details of all these foraged animals and plants here, then in the database can read and can use it to understand historical, more sporadic data sources about beekeeping in Europe. So acorn is the key, not only in the historical sources, but also for swineards. Already in April and May, they are looking and try to forecast the acorn production for the autumn. They are really very keen on making predictions because the whole production systems depends on the quantity and quality of acorns. They are unhappy when the acorns fall unripe in July and August because they are bitter and not as nutritious. They are often wormy. Then when the acorns fall, then first they are spicy, bitter, or hot, and they are waiting for the first rains that wettens the acorns, and then the acorns become more healthy and more sweet, and pigs like these sweet acorns more. So this can impact when the acorn season can start. When the acorns are germinating, then they are almost the most loved by pigs. But if the acorns spend some months in the marshes covered with water, then they are even more sweet. Svignar's knowledge on acorns is very rich. I just brought here 2 examples. The second is related to climate change, because if the hot days in July increase, which is the prediction and actually is already ongoing, then it will kill acorns and decrease the production. If we compare the knowledge on acorn feeding from the 5 knowledge sources we used, then the living traditional knowledge says that acorns are good, but pigs also need earthworms and grasses because the acorns are burning their stomach. Similar observations for wild boars. They also need some additional food. We also observed this, that the pigs switch between acorn and earthworms and also graze grasses, and they like buried acorns that are already germinating. There are nice studies from the Deheza that larger acorns are less bitter and more tasty. And there's also some knowledge from the ethnographic and historical sources, but mostly about the herders, what knowledge herders need to do good pennage. Another topic I show is the browsing on trees and shrubs, because it impacts the shrub layer. Svignar's knowledge is the richest from all other sources. They have very detailed knowledge which species are preferred and less preferred or not eaten. We have only few observations because of limited time. Ethnographers were not interested at all, almost no information. From the Deheza, we don't have information because there were no bushes in the studied areas. And it is difficult to detect in stomach and feces of wild boar, so there's a very low information from wild boar literature. Ethnographers often mention that roots are important forages for pigs, and also wild boar literature mentions that wild boar regularly feeds on roots. However, we could not observe it. We were really trying hard, but not a single second was observed when the pigs ate roots. We asked the Svignars and they said that no, they have no information on that. They have never seen it. Ethnographers listed 3 times, but no details. And from the Deheza literature, we only have few data. So this is still a contradictory case. We don't know how much roots pigs ate in the past in the forests of Central Europe. Earthworm is a dominant food in our study area. And we have nice quotes from the herders. We also observed it many, many times, and we even calculated that up to 1,000 earthworms can be consumed by an individual pig We have binoculars, so we could go closer to the pigs than swinyards. Ethnographers only mentioned several times it was not important for them. For the Deheza literature, we only have few data. And for the wild boar literature, we know that pigs eat earthworms regularly, but usually in small quantities. But also they stimulate or increase the abundance of earthworms by the rootings. Rhizomes of Carex species, they are vital food source in the winter, especially in our study area, and they contribute to the opening up of the marshes and providing habitats for red-listed species. Many species disappeared from Central European countries after pig keeping in forest was abandoned. Another example of feeding on roots and rhizomes of marsh plants. This has very important relevance for conservation. So my last slide is some take-home messages. Pigs in the oak forest is not only about masting on acorns. So they keep rooting up the soil and looking for other forages. The archived tech from historical and ethnographic sources differed substantially from the living tech. And the historical literature was much poorer in ecological content. Cross-knowledge system reviewing was a challenge, but it was enjoyable. The different knowledge sources widened our scope of understanding. We found nice contradictions and inconsistencies, but less than expected. And we realized that the knowledge documented in different sources heavily depending on the person, the scientist who documented the knowledge. And learning from wild boar literature for conservation impact of domestic pigs has big limitations, so we do not suggest it. And because we only found several knowledgeable swinyards and all were above the age of 65, we argue that this knowledge, which was vital in Central Europe or in Europe for centuries, is critically endangered and part of our European cultural heritage. And this is the film we produced on this situation. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Zsolt. It has been very, very interesting. At the moment, there is no questions here in the chat, but I have one question for you about the living tech. There is not only an interview, rather is living with them for some time, living with the farmers, and the field work is living with them.
Yes, yes. You know, if you interview people in a room, then they exercise their knowledge and they try to comply to your questions, and the whole situation is very much limited methodologically. So you can do nice interviews in indoor, but you will miss important aspects, especially the practices and the worldview dimensions. If you go with them into the field, then you can observe their behavior, their reactions to different situations, habitat, the pig behavior. And also during a field walk in the forest, in the marsh, they are more informal. So you can go much more deeply into the story. We also use 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century historical sources, and we interviewed them by reading the sentences historians collected from beekeepers in the 18th century, for example, and what they think about it. So they use their knowledge to interpret historical knowledge. And for example, about the acorn monitoring, we have some historical sources from the 16th century, which was enriched by these beekeepers' information.
Okay, so it's different the writing record and the other one, the living with them, is the results are different, no? For the
yes, yeah.
Okay, very good. Here is one question. How did the densities of how is the densities of pig differ? This is a problem in eastern USA with wild pigs.
Yeah, so the density of pigs is always changing because the number of pigs depends on the actual number of offsprings in a village. So there's an intraannual fluctuation. There's also an impact of markets. Today, the African plague impacts pigs because they were expelled from the forest to prevent contact with wild boar. The density of wild boar is also heterogeneous in Central Europe. In Hungary, there is an overpopulation of wild boar. In this case, in this part of Serbia, there is a limited number of wild boars. And these pigs are free-ranging, but are returning every day to the central place in the forest. So they don't cover the whole forest. 50 years ago, there were much more pigs in the forest than recently. So it's always a question of densities. And if the density is high, then the impact on marshes and forests are not beneficial. Maybe more beneficial to marshes than to forests.
Okay, second question from the chat. Do women interact with pigs and boars too? Do women contribute to keep this traditional knowledge?
That's an interesting. We also are interested in herder women's knowledge. In Hungary, we established a herder women group last year. And after tomorrow, we will have a meeting with these women herders. In this case, in Serbia, women are not in the forest. Some of them visited or lived in the forest with her husband and then participated in the pasturing and keeping the pigs. But usually in this village situation, there is a niche separation of women and men jobs, and the pig keeping is a man job. But for example, in one cases, the herder's wife was more knowledgeable than the herder itself because the woman was much more observant, and she spent years in the forest. So we also have data especially from medicinal plants and curing of pigs from women.
Very good, thank you. Another question is, what do you think there are not a lot of studies about this item from ethnographic instead of history has got studies? Both are related.
I don't exactly get the question. What is the question? Could Melanie ask? Could you ask in Spanish and have a translation, because I don't get the point.
Sí, dime.
¿Cómo es que si no, o sea, los aportes que hay para la etnografía son muy bons, ¿cómo es que para el caso de historia sí más que al final está relacionado?
En el campo de la traditional ecological knowledge.
Entonces, en la etnografía los aportes eran muy pobres, ¿no?
Ah, sí.
Pero al final la etnografía y historia está relacionado, ¿no? Se habla de los modos de uso.
Vale.
En plan eso que experiencia o por qué cree que para lo que es la etnografía hay tan pocos datos de tradicional?
Okay, I will try to translate. In your lecture, you said that there is few sources of ethnography, but what about the historical sources? They can substitute to ethnographic sources in your studies.
So actually, we did not look for ethnographic sources or historical sources or other sources because we used a digital database. About 30 million thousands of pages of Hungarian and related texts are scanned in a searchable form in 2 big databases in Hungary. And we looked for keywords. So we read all sources that were available. Most sources were ethnographic or local historian and sources. And we looked not for social data or economic data, which are really abundant, but for ecological knowledge. And even if we found thousands of sources on acorn or masting, acorn feeding from historical sources, there was almost no ecological knowledge documented for in these sources. So we looked for a specific knowledge, not general knowledge on beekeeping.
Okay, many thanks. I think we have another. Yes, the link you offered.
I will put it in the chat.
Okay.
And if anybody has a question, I will also include my email address, and then you can.
Okay.
Sure. Thank you.
Perfect. Many thanks.